Does this work?
Yes.
Thanks all for being here. Okay. Nobody does anything alone. Even when the best people try, what really happens is they make different music when they start playing in different bands. And of course, I'm no different. I also play in different bands, in different places. We keep recreating the we that makes possible the I, on many scales and in many ways. Today the show seems to be about what I have done. So it makes sense for me to say thank you to a lot of people who made this possible, including my family, whom I don't mention in the book. Thanks. But it's really about you all, or to be precise, about us. This is what it's all about, but why? That's a strange question, but really it's a good question. The relevance. We can also say, there is a way in which I learned all this from engaging with people who used it in practice. This is a way to think of research and theory. It's a kind of practice, and just like any other practice, the most important thing, what it really means, is how it connects with other practices. This idea of practice research has been developed by the people you've just seen on the pictures, and others, people like Ole Dreyer, Uffe Jensen, and others. We think of research as engaging in practical experiments. But this doesn't mean it's in a world of its own. So we think of the experiments as prototypical practices. Practices that are at the front line of development. It's about creating prototypes and discussing them, articulating what they are and what they imply. Prototypes. They're usually thought of as industrial ones. But here's another kind of prototype. If you want to learn about collectives, participation, and subjectivity, then it's a good idea to engage with people who create just that. Certain kinds of pedagogical and social work practices. So here's Schagel, the crew, around 1994. A youth social work project. The picture is from the front page of a book they wrote about themselves. So maybe you think this is like a youth club. But it isn't. To some extent, Jackson here is inviting us to his own project, what he hopes will be one day a dancing club. This was just the point. These social workers didn't make an organization and then invited the young people. They built collectives, each time anew, together with the young people. They had this motto, meeting the young people on neutral ground and in movement. In a way, what I'll do here is try to explain what that means. For one thing, it means that the youth workers were all the time moving. And so were the youth, or we could say that what they did together had the character of a movement, like a social movement. One key aspect of this was the practice of creating collectives and participants. Many of these people had a background in various kinds of grassroots activism. They were used to the idea that the collectives didn't exist as empty shells or institutions. All the time they were only what they did together. Like when the crew made the show Audio Twist, Will Twist Survive, 93, a big musical performance with all kinds of people involved. An activity and at the same time collective. This was connected with political aspirations to overcome marginalization. They were able to include some young people who were otherwise quite hard to work with in the institutions. Another example is the Know Your Place festivals, middle 90s. The attempt to connect various local organizations and people in new ways so that marginalized people, like street kids or immigrant boys and so on, who sold drugs, could participate. Why is that important? The institutions of the welfare state are often marginalizing, even when they're supposed to be the opposite. This is a struggle that's never settled. The social youth workers could see it in their field, the clubs and the boarding homes, etc. And they could see how it connected with the ways that young people were divided among themselves as subcultural groups, and also in and between the educational institutions. But it's a general problem in many state institutions that work with people. We tend to focus our attention on individuals and their problems. And this often leads us to make collectives that don't do a very good job of including people and helping them develop. In a way, we all know it. Who wants to be one of those people who belong to that kind of institutions, for addicts, for mentally ill, for criminals? But what else could we do? Good question. But first of all, I think we should ask who we. This is just the point. If we want to do something about that, we've got to be no longer so sure who we are. No longer just the normal people or just the professionals. We must cultivate the courage to put ourselves at stake. In other words, the idea of meeting young people on neutral ground in the movement implies taking risks. Taking risks is also about power. In our kind of society, power is mostly expressed in the ways that people are moved between institutions. Within the institutions where we work with people, that power is taken for granted, and often we pretend it's not there. In a way, this is what institution means. But when we meet on neutral ground, we have to face it. This means, among other things, challenging some deep and high barriers, for instance, between police work and social work on the street level, or between youth work and politics. That's very difficult. And an important part of the reason that those youth and social workers worked in ways that I can take as prototypical for very big issues. In sum, the revolutionary idea was this: we make us include the excluded. This is also revolutionary because of the way that power dynamics and ideologies are changing in these times of new public management, with the rise of self-help and user perspectives. You might say that challenging narrow professionalism as such is really not that groundbreaking today, and self-help and user influence is all over the place. I would agree. But the crucial point is how this is done. I claim that this way of interpreting what it means to take the perspective of the users and to develop user influence is revolutionary because it takes us beyond a liberal cornerstone, the idea of autonomous users in a free civil society. And this, in turn, is important because it's just that idea that keeps producing marginalization. The users of public services aren't just autonomous users or consumers. And if we try to force it on them, many of them are pushed out. Let me explain a bit more in detail what this is relevant for. Why it can be seen as different from some basic ideas in our culture, including social sciences such as psychology. In most social science, the idea of society does the same thing as the social workers do in their institutions. Take the power that defines the whole thing for granted. Society seems to exist in an abstract space, and we don't notice how that space has been cut out. Within that space, what we see are individuals that interact. Here's an example of this view. Marx saying, the premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions under which they live. So, yes, Marx himself tended to think of the state and politics as something secondary, either as a kind of unimportant frame to the picture of society, or as something destructive. This has had a lot of consequences for the social sciences, and also for the labor movements and various socialist movements. There's a really big discussion. In any case, the very dominant idea about human collectives is the idea of the group. The group is just a gathering of individuals. The idea is an abstraction from how it's gathered, what they're gathered to do, and all that. The frame, we might call it. But let's try to keep that frame inside here. In a way, it's not really that difficult to see how groups have been formed. A school class is one group. They seem to be just individuals with different abilities and so on. And when we turn our backs, they start to fight each other and bully each other. But really, they were not put together on a deserted island by some accident like in the book The Lord of the Flies. We just tend to forget that, because all we see when we do focus on management, like classroom management, is function. Of course, we can find more advanced ideas about collectives in places where those groups have been managed, industrial organization. But even those ideas tend to be functionalistic. We sort of forget that people are people and that we're people too. The whole discussion or fight about what is for and why, in short, we ignore or we bracket subjectivity. And that is what functionalism is. If we regard functionalism as a disregarding of subjectivity, of ourselves and what we want, of power, we can distinguish two kinds. I found these two examples on the internet. They're easy to find. This one is functionalism of task, where the collective seems to be a rational machinery that turns input into output. And that one is a picture of functionalism of life, where the collective appears to want nothing except just to survive, so it's a system that reproduces itself. These two ways of thinking have been dominant in organizational theory. In general, the social sciences have taken that kind of functional rationality as their starting point, left all the rest to psychiatry and psychology, the irrational and the deviant and so on. The moment we take people seriously at all, we meet them as rational agents who calculate their own interests. But this has pushed the whole problem of community to the side. There is a longing for belonging that is not only a longing for the old days when we believed that people knew where they belong. At least we hope it can be more than that. We probably all share that hope in different ways, but to the social sciences it becomes a problem. It's like in the myth of King Midas. The moment we touch it, it dies. We change community into organization or society or group in order to handle it scientifically, and this means it no longer is what we know it should be. The community we long for becomes a ghost, keeps resurrecting from the dead, either in bad shapes such as bullying or crowd planning, or in wonderful but utopian shapes such as visions of a harmonious and productive community. The best versions of social sciences have generally tried to get beyond functionalism, but have often ended in some kind of utopian idea of nice and innocent human beings, like Marx, as we saw perhaps. And like many of the theories about community that have built on Marx and his ideas, such as cultural and historical psychology. There's nothing wrong with hopes for a utopia like that, I think, but typically we turn them into science by pretending that they exist empirically in the world as some kind of essence, as for instance the everyday life that really lies behind or inside of the rational organizations. In any case, an important project is to get beyond that bad choice between functionalism and utopians. This is where we can learn from people who work with creating the us that includes them, the excluded. Yeah, remember that. Okay, so the key idea, to make a very long story very short, is that the problems come from a lack of reflection of our own involvement. So, what I try out in the book is this idea: the collective subject perspective, or in short, the we, how we make us. Not just as an approach to social or youth work, but also to social sciences. This way of thinking, the way of thinking that takes this perspective, can be called dialectics. This is something that comes from Hegel 200 years ago and has been described in many different ways. In one version, it's a set of ideas about how nature and the world is connected and develops through certain stages with an iron necessity, so that whatever we do, the end point will be defined in advance. This is called teleological determinism. But I've taken up a very different version of dialectics, one that thinks it as reflexive modernism, the kind of modernism that takes a collective subject standpoint. This means that we approach social life through reflecting on the practices we're engaged in, how we make ourselves in the process. Teleology is about projects. Many people hate the idea of social engineering because they think it's always technocratic. But we have to face the fact that social sciences can only be relevant if they are connected with building our collectives. We are in that business whether we like it or not. Part of dialectical reflection is that we move through contradictions. Our thinking and our practice, our projects, are about changing things and changing ourselves. With its inevitable negative moment where we try to break up what exists, and its positive moment when we build something new. In other words, this implies critique. But the process never ends, so we could say it's a critique of critique. This happened also in Copenhagen. Like so many other social workers, these wild social youth workers criticized the capitalist society and its social exclusion. But then they also criticized the utopian or functionalistic ways of making social work institutions to deal with that problem. The idea of critique is reflected in the structure of the theory that I have presented in my book. I use Hegel's strange terms for that dialectical movement. In itself is our first move when we point to some thing or essence in the world as the new ground, the real thing that we are looking for. In this case, the collective, where collectivity is a kind of substance, immanent, built into what we see to those individuals in their activity, as Marx said. And then the for itself, the critique of this, where we can see that the collective is not just a substance with some immanent meaning and structure, but it's really just an order or a structure that is imposed on it. It is not innocent, but all about power, even when the participants impose the structure on themselves. And finally, in and for itself, the critique of critique, where we ask for the relevance of that description. Who are we to do that, and why? The point where we think of the collective as ourselves, and we include our own thinking. To some extent, this structure reflects the movement of thoughts and reflections among the social youth workers I collaborated with in the 90s. At least that's one way to tell that story. They first set out to create collectives with meaningful activity. Then they worked with how such collectives were framed and designed. And then finally they understood that what they were doing was to create collectives as part of a fight to expand the welfare state. Let me explain a bit more in detail. In itself, creating collectives on neutral ground and in movement could mean, instead of working in stigmatizing institutions where the clients wasted their time and were not included, it could mean to create meaningful collaborative projects. What is a meaningful project? At this point, we think of the project as meaningful in itself. The project becomes a collective, a social unit, because the way the activities make sense to participants is connected with how they are part of a larger social practice where meaning is objectively defined and always developed. Part of praxis with an X, to use a big word for a very big thing. Sense and meaning. These are two concepts that view the same exchange from two opposite sides. We can suggest such a meaningfulness as a structure that is built into the project, immanent to the project, part of it. For instance, the structure of ends and means, agents and objects. Instead of the clients being oppressed as objects that are treated by professionals to achieve or fail to achieve a normality defined in advance with the help of therapy, what if they changed to being activists who are themselves agents of an organic civic canteen in a community center, striving for a city ecology in their kitchen work, using recipes in pots and pans? That kind of meaningful collectivity would then be quite different, a different venue for learning, a different way of overcoming marginalization. This was created in a project they called Service, User Service. But in reality, it wasn't quite as innocent as that. In fact, when they described themselves as activists, they tried to repress the facts that they were also still clients and social workers. Sometimes we talk of this as the paradox of the horny hooker. In prostitution, it seems to be also the case that to get things done, people have to pretend the opposite. The important thing is that the prostitute's desire is irrelevant. But to make it happen, both participants pretend that her desire is important. And maybe, likewise, the participants in the user service pretended that they were activists in order to engage as clients and as social workers. In general, the meaningfulness that we thought of as immanent to the collective was something attributed. And the point was that this attribution was important to what was really happening. It had consequences. Typically, this was thought of as bad consequences. If we went too far down that road, the collectives were no longer real communities of practice, real activism. Instead, they became instrumentalized for certain functions. We ended up in the choice between functionalism and utopianism, just like in the tradition of cultural historical psychology. In order to understand this, we had to step back from the solidarity that made us keen to see the user service projects as the real thing, as meaningful activism. So this is the for itself. In user service, people talk about frame design, but really that way of thinking was more developed in other places. Places like the crew that I mentioned before. There, they didn't pretend that they didn't do social work. They also created the real thing, but that was itself a kind of social work, only they framed it differently. When they made the musical I mentioned, they played themselves as street kids. They used the stigmatizing categories, but they changed their meaning. Frame design implies regarding the structure of a collective as a discourse, a set of concepts and ideas. This view of collective is something that participants can take to form it. This is called framing. It's like if I say, let us say that we're at a doctoral defense, and I am the candidate and you're the audience. This discursive or interactionist view of collectivity works best when the categories are relatively fixed. This is typically the case because they're fixed in artifacts, like paper, that are specialized for the purpose. Models that stabilize meaning. Texts are in that sense ideal artifacts, but even other things can work that way, like rooms and furniture, such as the school desks here, that define the structure of pupil and teacher. The stabilization of meaning makes indirect forms of power possible, and this is just what an institution is, when the collective is fixed and stabilized in a certain form. And this is why it can be revolutionary and very difficult to make different kinds of collective. Oops, that was too early, sorry. But at this stage, we have lost that revolutionary impulse because we have begun to play with who we are. In a sense, it's all just framing. For instance, in another project, they would define themselves as wild youth, and there were many clever considerations behind that way of framing the project. But who was it that did the framing itself and why? This set of questions corresponds to a problem with the tradition of post-structuralism in the social sciences. When we focus on discourse as something that orders practice and collectivity, all we can do in the end is to refuse what we are, in the famous words of Michel Foucault. But of course, as long as we still live in this world, we cannot only refuse, we cannot pretend that we only do the negative moment of critique. We end up with a bad choice again, this time between the cynicism of rejecting all values and motives, and on the other hand, a return to a naive authenticity. In other words, as soon as we begin to ask, so what? We need more than discourse. We must zoom out once again and reflect ourselves as constituting ourselves with that discourse, deliberately, with certain debatable projects and agendas. We have to return to the standpoint that we bracketed before, to be able to work with discourse and framing. But how? This is where we need the next step of the art, in influence. This begins with the question, who, we? But it doesn't stop at asking how we define ourselves. It goes on to consider struggles for power and recognition. The concept of recognition, anarchism, it begins when the other, not only as a position in the structure, but as a subject, is turned into an object, is subjected, without ceasing to be a subject. When I recognize you, and you me, then we also recognize us in a certain way, and together we recognize me. Recognition is both about seeing the other, but also about how this has consequences, not just for the other, but also for oneself. We know that from when states recognize or don't recognize each other. We also know it from how we all learn to deal with ourselves. We participate in collectives that deal with us, but only if we're lucky enough. One main point is that being turned into an object, being subjected, is not necessarily bad. The question is how it's done. To understand all this, the traditions in the social sciences that have dealt with ideology and ideology critique become useful. Ideology is just about how a collective, often that has been discussed as a state, struggles for recognition as a power in the world, and at the same time constituted itself. But the important thing is, it did that in ways that could and should be overcome. The people who do ideology critique don't just refuse. They have always been normative. They've always also constructed new ideology, which other people can then criticize. I like that. Ideology critique always zooms out a little bit more to ask who we are and why we ask as we do. The ideology of a collective can also be called its common sense, because it fixes who we are, as opposed to transforming us, as opposed to developing us through the construction of meaning. Such common sense can only be seen from the point of view of ideology critique, of the critique of how it blocks the development of meaning, and how it only allows participants a limited kind of recognition. For example, in the crew there are strong forces that try to constitute the collective as either a professional institution or a self-help community. Sometimes I was part of that, when I interviewed them being an evaluator, because the common sense idea of user interview was very much linked with politics, both in social work and in the university system. These ideologies were both in different ways utopian. They had certain ideals built into them that were quite far from mundane reality, but which were very strong nonetheless, such as the idea that the professional should be detached, or the opposite idea that all participants were just friends. In the words of the philosopher Ernst Bloch, any ideology contains utopia, and often of a very abstract kind. But the ideology critique itself is no exception. In fact, it's a general aspect of collectives that we define and constitute ourselves in terms of hopes. We are, in a sense, who we strive to become, and what we recognize are potentials. This is yet another way to interpret the idea of meeting on neutral ground in the movement. So, this was the overall theory of collectivity in very broad strokes. One of the main points about it is that it has certain implications for how we approach subjectivity, a subjectivity of participation. This is, of course, why it articulates a kind of pedagogy or social youth. First of all, it's an alternative to the idea that we should imagine something we call the subject in some kind of everyday life. Not because that is somehow wrong, but because it would mean that we couldn't question some of the presuppositions and conditions for that. For instance, we don't know what we're doing if we interview someone as a subject in her everyday life. Perhaps we're just thinking in the ideological terms of civil society and user autonomy. Our entry point here is still that we learn through practice. So, how is individual subjectivity relevant in practices like the ones I have participated in and theorized? I can only sketch a few points. First, the focus on recognition implies an idea of interpolation. The collective, in a way, calls the individual to be participant and to recognize himself as such. For instance, as a wild youth. The process is delicate because there is an aspect of submission, even if the first moment is on neutral ground. Becoming a participant is subjecting oneself to the common sense of the collective, with its hopes and its ideas about potentials. But realizing those potentials always changes them. It always pushes toward transformation of the collective. It has an aspect of ideology critique in it. For instance, when the crew began to recognize and interpolate the young immigrant men from the neighborhood as what they call wild youth, that would change the crew radically and give birth to a whole different collectives such as wild learning, Secondly, when we recognize us and our participants in terms of potentials and hopes, this means we approach subjectivity in terms of narratives. And when it's about human individuals, those are narratives of life, of living an everyday life and of living a life from birth to death. As we can learn from Terry Masonry, among others, this does not mean that we only deal with something that is told or written. Narratives, they are also lived. But when we constitute ourselves with them, we use the spoken or written narratives. The narrative of a wild youth who becomes a wild social worker is a very strong and very precarious and complex thing to work with. It takes a lot to make that utopia concrete and credible, and sometimes it fails. Thirdly, the thing that anchors sense as different from meaning is that subjectivity is situated. A collective such as the one we're performing right now is situated in time and space, and this finality and mortality is a key to how we make sense of it. In the case of the human individual, this is all about life. The way I make sense of things has to do with my bodily existence. This means that myself is a kind of concern that goes two ways. From my individual bodily life, and from the subject positions that I assume. This is important in pedagogical practice, among other things, because it's of course far from given that any individual person will let herself be interpolated into some collective. There's always the question of the person's criteria for that. If we want to understand those criteria, a classical issue of motivation in psychology, we're forced to think in existential terms, and in terms of needs that have a bodily aspect to them. This doesn't mean just basic needs. At this point, we can really learn from Udo Osterkamp's reconstruction of our needs for developing agency through participation. Yet the other side of that same coin is that I also look at myself the opposite way, from the subject position I assume as participant, to how I should deal with my body and my existence. We all know examples of people who did strange things with their bodies, for instance, unhealthy things, even to the point of getting killed, for the sake of the ideals and standards given to their position. Right. As I said, dialectics is a never-ending process. Once we reach the level of the theory of collectives in and for itself and sketch out its implications, we can begin to become aware of the next critique, the problems and limitations of that theory. I'm sure the committee will point to many of those problems and limitations. But let me finish by pointing to just two of the problems myself. One of the main points about the research I did was to achieve conceptualization of collectivity as subjective, as the we, connected with understanding how collectives are constituted in power. This was what could be approached in dialogue with youth social workers that tried to meet youth on neutral ground in a movement in order to overcome marginalization. That way, a fundamental presupposition in pedagogical and social work, as well as in social theory, could be dealt with. But this also led to a problem. If you see society from the outside, from the margins, you get to see a lot, but there are also things that fade from view. This was exemplified in how one of the few books that was a shared reference between myself and the often self-taught and wild social youth workers were Benson Makarenko's The Road to Life. Here was one person who talked in ways that resembled and sometimes directly referred to Makarenko. But Makarenko's wonderful story is about a colony of street kids in the early 1920s in Ukraine. That situation is very different from Copenhagen at the other end of that century. The difference is, among other things, the building of a welfare state and a welfare society, and the ways that participation in today's Denmark requires academic education. The social youth workers struggled with how to deal with the educational institutions, and this was even connected with their own academic training or the lack of it, and through this, with their dialogue with me and other academics. Reintegrating this should not mean just forgetting the points we learned from meeting youth on neutral ground and in movement, or forgetting the theory of collectives that I've made. It should build on those ideas. To some extent, this work has already been taken up. The long march through educational institutions has been attempted in projects like Wild Learning or the Copenhagen School of Wild Social Work or the Ecological Production School. The whole theme is central in Line Derksen-Mørk's work, so I hope I will be able in the future to refer to the next volume in the book series about the subjectivity of participation. But of course, this is part of a much bigger struggle. Just as the prototype of automobile would end up being nothing if people hadn't gone on to build a whole infrastructure of roads and gas stations, so this prototype can only be relevant as long as there is an expansive and responsive welfare state that continuously seeks to overcome itself by creating collectives to include the excluded. Although the emergence and growth of a welfare state is a process of a great historical dimension, goes far beyond the immediate politics, it's reasonable to doubt whether we can still hope for that kind of reflexive social engineering, and perhaps to fear the reduction of the welfare state to an oscillation between liberalism and conservatism, which is really the extreme separation of humanism and subjectivity from power and objectivity. But this book I wrote in the hope that the collectivism of welfare state socialism would survive and grow. Allow me to finish with that hope.